He said it while she was standing right there. Not to her. That was the part that stayed with Sienna afterward, long past the lobby, long past the walk back through the service corridor, and the 15 minutes she spent gripping the edge of the prep sink with both hands. He had said it about her. To the man in the charcoal suit beside him, in the voice he used for things he'd already filed away as handled, "She'll figure it out. She always does." And then he had kept walking, and the elevator had closed, and Sienna had stood in the Crane building lobby, holding a folder of event invoices she'd been trying to give him for 3 days. And the 2 investors from Dallas, who didn't know her name, had looked briefly in her direction before looking away. She had been waiting 23 minutes. She knew because she'd watched the clock above the front desk. She had positioned herself near the coffee station. She restocked every morning, a task no one had asked her to take on, and no one had asked her to stop. And she had waited while his 4 ran long, and his assistant walked past her twice without acknowledgement, and a man she didn't recognize asked if she was there about the catering for Thursday. She'd said yes, even though that wasn't why she was there. It was easier than explaining the real reason. The real reason was complicated and small, and not the kind of thing you said in a lobby. She was still holding the folder when she walked back to Hollow Cup. If someone asked what Sienna Voss actually did for a living, she would say she ran a café, which was true. Hollow Cup occupied the ground floor corner of the Crane building, had 42 seats, a rotating seasonal menu, and a pastry case that sold out by 10 most mornings. She'd opened it 3 years ago when her daughter Tilly was 4, after her marriage had ended with the particular quiet brutality of 2 people who'd stopped reaching for each other and simply let go. The cafe was her idea, her lease, her 6 a.m. alarm every day, including the mornings when Tilly had a fever or a nightmare, or just one of those phases where she needed her mother in her line of sight while she ate breakfast. What Sienna did for Desmond Crane was harder to describe. It had started with a catering request, the kind that came through her general inquiry form and probably should have gone to a larger operation. But she'd said yes because the number was good and the event had gone well, and afterward his executive assistant Renata had called and asked if she could handle the quarterly board luncheons. She'd said yes to that too, and then the monthly client dinners, and then the informal requests that weren't really requests. Could you make sure there's something up here by 7? He didn't eat before the Chicago call, which she fulfilled because her cafe was 40 steps from the service elevator, and she was usually there anyway, and it genuinely didn't feel like a burden at the time. 2 years later, she knew that Desmond Crane took his coffee black until noon and with 1 sugar after. She knew that his head of operations had a shellfish allergy his assistant had never formally logged. She knew which board members were managing difficult divorces and needed to be seated away from each other, which clients preferred sparkling to still, which of the building's maintenance crew had a birthday in March that nobody else would remember. She remembered things. That was the mechanism by which she had made herself, over the course of 2 years, completely indispensable without title or contract, or anyone asking why she kept showing up before the sun did. She had never taken a day off that she hadn't rescheduled around. She had also, in 6 weeks, not opened the letter from her cardiologist. It sat behind the register. She had slid it there the morning it arrived and had moved it twice when it got buried under delivery manifests, and both times she had told herself, after Friday's event, after the board luncheon, after things quiet down a little. Things did not quiet down. She had learned this in the first year of running a cafe and relearned it every month since, and she kept telling herself it anyway because the alternative was admitting that she was using the business as a reason not to be afraid. She was afraid. She'd gotten dizzy twice in the past month, not dramatically, not in a way anyone would notice, a momentary grip of the counter, a brief narrowing of the world, and then it passed and she straightened and went back to the line. The fatigue was different, heavier than the tiredness she'd been running on for 3 years, which had itself been heavy enough. She'd noticed it the way you notice something you're hoping will resolve on its own, peripherally, with deliberate avoidance. She wanted to tell someone. That was the thing she had been trying to do for 3 days. Not to file a report or get permission or ask for anything practical. Just tell someone. She'd been living inside this quiet fear alone, the way she lived inside most things, and she had arrived at the point where carrying it by herself had started to feel physically impossible, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. She needed to set it down, just for a moment, in front of someone who would register it. She had chosen Desmond. This was the fact she would examine later from multiple angles and never entirely explain to herself. Not Renata, who she saw daily and liked. Not Rosa, who ran the morning shift and would have listened with her whole body. She had chosen Desmond, and the choosing made a kind of sense that she refused to look at directly. She spent more waking hours in his building than anywhere else on earth, and somewhere in the 2 years of early mornings and remembered preferences and quiet presence, she had started to believe she was not entirely invisible to him. She'll figure it out. She always does. She had believed that incorrectly. The morning she collapsed had started the way most of her mornings started, before 5:30. Tilly had been up twice in the night with a low-grade fever that had broken by morning, which meant Sienna had spent the hours between 2 and 5 a.m., sitting on the edge of a twin bed, watching her daughter's breathing even out, too alert to sleep, too tired to think clearly. By 5, she was in the café kitchen, pulling trays from the walk-in, doing the math on how many hours she'd slept in the past week, as if the number would tell her something useful. The number was not useful. She had 2 Tylenol and half a cup of coffee and kept moving, because moving was the mechanism she had developed for not sitting still with things she couldn't fix. By 8, she had prepped the morning case, briefed Rosa, walked Tilly to school. Tilly was fine by then, rosy-cheeked and chattering about something her teacher had said about butterflies, and made it back to the cafe in time for the 9 o'clock rush. At noon, she ate 4 bites of a sandwich standing up. At 2, she sat down on the prep stool in the back kitchen for what she intended to be 5 minutes. Just 5. The headache that had been living behind her left eye since breakfast had shifted into something different, something with weight to it, and she closed her eyes for one moment against the fluorescent light. She thought about Tilly's butterfly project. She thought about the cardiologist's letter behind the register and the word follow-up in the 3rd paragraph that she had read once and then tucked away. She thought, I'll call tomorrow. Tomorrow when it's quieter. Tomorrow was the most useful word she knew. She had been saying it for 6 weeks. Rosa found her on the floor 20 minutes later. She had slid off the stool, which was the thing that would bother her afterward when she tried to reconstruct the sequence. She hadn't fallen so much as released, the way something releases when a pressure that's been building too long finally exceeds the structure holding it. Her face was the wrong color. Her breathing was wrong. Rosa had worked in the cafe for 18 months and knew the difference between someone who had fainted and something else, and this was something else. She called 911. Then she called up to the 14th floor and asked for Desmond Crane. He arrived in the kitchen before the ambulance did. Sienna was conscious by then, briefly, the world coming back to her in the specific way it comes back when you've been somewhere else, fragmented, soft at the edges, not entirely trustworthy. She saw the ceiling of her own kitchen. She saw Rosa's face. And then she saw Desmond crouched beside her with his jacket still on, and his phone in his hand, and an expression on his face that she did not have the presence of mind to interpret correctly, because correctly would have required acknowledging that the expression was something close to terror. She said, I'm sorry about the event Thursday. She heard Rosa make a sound that was not quite a laugh. Desmond said nothing. He put his hand over hers and held it flat against the floor, and his hand was warm, and that was the last thing she was aware of clearly before the paramedics came through the back entrance and the world fractured again into procedure and equipment and voices using her name. The ambulance ride was efficient and impersonal, the way those rides always are. Desmond was in the back. She didn't ask how he'd gotten there. She was too tired to ask anything, too tired even to be embarrassed, which was its own kind of relief. She had spent 2 years being perfectly composed in front of this man, and now she was on a stretcher with an oxygen monitor on her finger, and he was watching her the way people watch something they've been taking for granted long enough that the sudden visibility of it is almost painful. He answered yes when the paramedic asked if he was family. She heard it through the oxygen mask. She didn't correct him. At the hospital, a cardiologist named Dr. Aldine explained it in the way doctors explain things when they want to be honest without being alarming. A convergence of factors: severe fatigue, nutritional deficit, not dramatic, not the kind that gets noticed, just long-term and quiet, the kind that accumulates in people who eat around their schedule rather than in it. And the arrhythmia, irregular heartbeat, flagged 6 weeks ago in a routine screen, the follow-up letter sitting behind a café register because she had never found a moment that felt important enough to stop for. Minor in isolation, the doctor said. Combined with the other factors, it's what caused the collapse. Desmond sat in the waiting room and did not sit. He stood at the window and counted things: the cars in the lot, the distance between the light poles, anything with a number. This was what he did when his mind needed something to hold and there was nothing useful available. She'll figure it out. She always does. He had said it at 4:47. She had been found on her kitchen floor at 5:14. He had said it with the casual certainty of a man who had looked at Sienna Voss for 2 years and decided she was a constant, the way weather was a constant, the way certain things simply continued because they always had. He had taken the continuity as evidence that everything was fine. He had not considered that continuity could be a performance, that the thing that looked like effortlessness was sometimes just effort that had learned to be invisible. He thought about the coffee she left at his assistant's desk on the mornings his first meeting ran early. He had never mentioned it. He had assumed it was part of the catering contract somewhere. He had not asked. He was still standing at the window when his head of security, a man named Gil, who had been with the Crane organization for 8 years, called his personal phone and said there was something he needed to know. The cafe's vendor access logs had flagged an anomaly, routine security audit, the kind that ran quarterly and usually produced nothing, but this one had produced something. A vendor ID registered under Voss Logistics, Henrik Voss listed as contact. Delivery sign-ins twice a week for 14 months, always during the morning rush, always the side entrance. The deliveries were real. Coffee supplies, pastry inventory, legitimate. But the man making them had been using the side door access to move documents through the building without touching the front desk security log. Small packets, nothing that scanned, the kind of thing that only becomes visible in retrospect when someone's looking for it. Henrik Voss was Sienna's older brother. He had helped her negotiate the original lease on Hollow Cup. He still had vendor credentials she'd set up for him when the cafe opened, because he'd handled deliveries in the early weeks when she couldn't afford staff, and he'd offered, and she had never thought to revoke them because he was her brother, and she trusted him without deciding to, the way you trust people who have always been there. Desmond stood in the empty cafe at 11 p.m. Gil had let him in, had offered to stay, had been declined, and looked at the vendor logs on his laptop and felt something cold and precise moving through him that was not yet a conclusion. He looked around the cafe. It was the first time he had been in it after hours. He had been in it dozens of times during service, quick stops at the counter, the occasional brief exchange, always in motion. Standing in it now, lights low, the smell of ground coffee and something faintly sweet in the air, he understood that he had never actually looked at this room. He had walked through it the way he walked through his own lobby, efficiently, toward the next thing, not registering what the space itself was. The scheduling notebook was behind the register. He found it because he was looking for an invoice she'd mentioned, and instead found 3 years of Sienna's handwriting, pressed into a spiral-bound notebook that had a grocery list on the inside front cover and 2 years of 2 lives compressed into its pages. His board members' dietary restrictions, Tilly's school calendar, the date of a kindergarten performance she had apparently attended after a 6 a.m. opening shift. A note about his head of operation shellfish allergy and handwriting that was smaller than the rest, like she'd written it fast, fitting it between two other things: delivery schedules, vendor contacts, and on a page dated 6 weeks ago, in the same small handwriting, Dr. Reeves says follow-up required, call to schedule, after Desmond's Friday event. Friday came and went. He counted 17 Fridays in the past 6 weeks. On the same page, smaller still, in the corner she had written scared, just that word. One word she had apparently written and then moved on from, the way she moved on from everything that was about her specifically. He sat in her café until the sky went from black to gray. He did not leave because leaving felt like the wrong direction. He had spent 2 years moving past this woman, and he did not want to move anymore. He called Gil before the café opened. Henrik Voss, he said, I need to speak with him today. Henrik was cooperative in the way people are cooperative when they know the architecture has already been found. Not contrite. Sienna's brother was not a contrite man, but efficient about it. The way says when they've decided the only remaining variable is how this gets handled. He'd been passing documents for a competitor, not financial documents, strategic ones, building plans, tenant negotiations, the kind of information that had no obvious price tag but accumulated into advantage over time if you were patient and positioned to use it. He had used his sister's cafe, her schedule, her invisible daily presence in the building. Nobody watches the coffee lady, he said, and the phrase landed in Desmond's chest like a stone, to move that information through a door she'd left open for him because she trusted him. Did she know? Desmond asked. Henrik looked at him with the flat certainty of someone who is still, even now, certain he knows his sister better than anyone else in the room. She never would have let me. That's why I didn't tell her. She never would have let you, Desmond repeated. Sienna doesn't do things like this, Henrik said. That was the point. You needed someone in that building who was genuinely. He stopped. It wasn't her problem. She didn't know. Desmond sat with that for a long moment. You used her, he said, not a question. I used the access she gave me. Henrik's voice had a distinction in it, careful and too fine. She gave you the access because you're her brother and she trusted you, Desmond said. Those are not separate things. He stood up. He told Henrik that Gil would be handling the formal part of this conversation. He did not tell Henrik what he was thinking, which was that there was a woman in a hospital bed who had just been told her heart needed monitoring, and who had sat with that information alone for 6 weeks, while she figured out whether Desmond Crane's Friday catering was covered, and the one person who should have known, who did know, because he watched her every day and understood exactly how close to empty she was running, had used that emptiness as infrastructure. Nobody watches the coffee lady. He had watched her. He had just never looked. He was at the hospital by 2 in the afternoon. Sienna was awake, propped up against the pillows, a cup of tea on the tray table that had gone cold. She turned her head when he came in, and her face did the thing it apparently always did, which he understood now he had simply never let himself register. It settled, like a room where someone had just adjusted the lighting. Like she had been slightly braced for something and had quietly released it when she saw him. He pulled the chair close and sat down. She said before he could speak, "How's Tilly?" He told her. Rosa had picked Tilly up from school. Tilly was fine, had been told her mother was resting, had made a card that Rosa had promised to bring by tomorrow. Sienna let out a breath. He told her everything. He decided this on the drive over, not in a strategic way, but in the absolute way. The way you decide something when you understand that the alternative is another version of the same failure you've already committed. He told her about the vendor logs and Henrik and the documents, and he told her about the notebook and what he'd found in it. He told her about sitting in her cafe in the dark and counting 17 Fridays since she'd written Call Doctor. Reeves in the margin of a page that was mostly about his people, his schedule, his world. He told her he'd read the word she'd written alone in the corner. She was quiet for a long time. She looked at the window, then at her hands, then at the tea that had been cold for an hour. "Henrik is my brother," she said finally. "I know." "I didn't." "I know you didn't know," he said. "I know that the same way I know anything I've learned about you in the past 2 years, which is by watching and not looking, and I am aware of the irony." Something moved in her face. "What were you trying to tell me?" he said. 3 days ago, in the lobby." She didn't answer immediately. Outside, a cart went past in the hallway. A PA system said something distant and flat. "I got a letter," she said, "about my heart, and I was scared and I wanted." She stopped, pressed her lips together, tried again. "I wanted to tell someone. I spend most of my life in your building, and I thought you'd." She looked at the ceiling. "I thought I had stopped being invisible to you." The monitoring machine beeped softly and steadily. "I'm sorry," he said. She turned her head and looked at him. Really looked, the way she hadn't let herself since he walked in, because looking required acknowledging that he had come, and that his being there meant something she was not prepared to calculate. "Okay," she said. Quiet, not absolution, not a conclusion, just a door she was willing to leave slightly open. He stayed. The cafe reopened on a Thursday 10 days later. It looked the same. It smelled the same. Coffee and the brown sugar rosa used in the morning buns, the particular warmth of a room that has been well used for a long time. Sienna stood in the doorway of the back kitchen and let it be familiar. She had been away from it for 10 days, which was the longest she'd been away from anything since Tilly was born, and returning had the quality of returning to yourself after a long time of being largely elsewhere. Some things were different. There was a second person behind the counter who hadn't been there before. Desmond had arranged it without announcing it. A hire, full-time, experienced, starting Monday. He had told her in the way he told her most things now, which was plainly and without performance. "You've been running this alone. You don't have to." She had not argued. She was learning with significant effort that not arguing was sometimes the more honest response. Henrik's vendor access had been revoked. The formal part of what came after that was not her business to manage, and Desmond had been clear about that. "This isn't yours to carry." She had sat with that for a long time before believing it. Henrik was her brother. She had known him to make choices she didn't understand. She had not known him to make choices like this, and the specific weight of that, the sibling grief of it, was something she was going to be in for a while. She knew that. She wasn't trying to resolve it faster than it wanted to go. She had her first cardiology follow-up scheduled for the coming Tuesday. She had put it in the scheduling notebook, her name, her appointment, her time, nobody else's. She was restocking the pastry case on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after she came home from the hospital, when Desmond came in before the rush. He did this now sometimes. Not every day, not on any schedule she could identify, just occasionally, in the quiet before the building filled up. He would come in and get his coffee, and sometimes he would stand at the counter for a few minutes, and sometimes he would sit at the small corner table near the window, and they would talk about practical things. Or they would not talk. And both of those things had started to feel natural in a way that still surprised her a little each time. That morning, he said her name, and she looked up and he was holding a piece of paper. She recognized it immediately. Tilly had given it to Rosa to bring by the previous week, a drawing in purple crayon of 2 stick figures in front of a building, one tall and one small, both holding what were clearly coffee cups. Tilly had labeled it in her emerging handwriting, "Mommy and Desmond at work." "Can I keep a copy?" he asked. She looked at him. He was looking at the drawing, not at her, with the focused attention he brought to things that mattered to him, and the specific lack of performance that she had come to understand was the version of him that was actually present, not constructing anything. "Yes," she said. He looked up. The morning light came through the corner window at the angle that had always made this room feel like it had been designed to be warm, though she knew it was just the east-facing glass and the hour. She had loved that light since the first week the cafe was open and had never mentioned it to anyone. because it was the kind of thing that belonged to her privately, a small-owned pleasure in a life she'd built largely for other people. She let him see her noticing it. He didn't say anything. He folded the drawing carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. He picked up his coffee. "I'll see you later," he said. "Yeah," she said, "you will." He walked out into the lobby and she watched him go, and the door swung shut behind him, and the cafe was warm and full of the smell of coffee and the morning, and she turned back to the pastry case with both hands steady.